Okay, so looks like we are live on VUX World, coming at you from the the isolation, inspiration, incubation, ideation, motivation station. I am your host, Kane Sims, and I'm joined, as always, by Dustin Coates. Dustin, how are you?
Hey Kane, how's it going? How
Pretty
many how
well.
many of those do you think you can get up to?
Um, Very good question. The isolation, inspiration, inflation, ideation, incubation, motivation, amplification station is where we're broadcasting from right now. How
Most
many was
most of
that?
my days are the procrastination station, I think is my home station.
Like it, like it. Yeah. So, welcome to the podcast. If you're tuning in on LinkedIn, or if you're listening to the regular podcast, or even on YouTube, welcome, welcome, welcome. This is the podcast where we dive into the specifics and the practical details about all things voice and conversational AI. So, we're looking at strategy, design, development, and today we are joined by an absolutely amazing, fantastic guest, Deborah Harrison. Deborah, welcome to VUX World.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled.
It's a pleasure to have you. Absolute pleasure to have you. So, for those of you that don't know Deborah, so you work at Microsoft and you were, and I love this, the first writer on the Cortana assistant.
That was me.
That is unbelievable. How did that come about?
I was working on the Windows Phone project at the time, and Cortana was going to be a feature on Windows Phone. And I had been working on, I was a team of writers, and we wrote whatever was our assignment for that particular release. And so I'd been doing accounts, and I was doing the Ubi, the setup flow and things like that. And Cortana came around, and it seemed groovy, and I just put my hat in the ring to see if I could work on it, not knowing, I don't know that any of us knew quite how large it was likely to be at that. Probably a few people who were in early knew where it was going, but I didn't. But it just seemed cool, and so I started working on the feature, and then it shipped in Windows Phone, and then there were two writers, and then there was two writers and a manager, and then there was a team, and then there was an international team, and here we are. And so yeah, it was amazing.
Wow. And kind of what was it like at that time? When was Cortana already a thing? Were you kind of involved in the creation of it? Like, at what stage were you brought in, and what did Cortana look like at that time?
Yeah, I was really early days, and so it had the team had formed, the engineering team had begun, and there had been talk about, for example, should it have an identity? At that point was an early question, and if so, what would that look like? And so the first project I was brought in to help with was actually looking at there were sort of two facets of it. And one was how should we organize the brief that would help us to hire voice talent, so that we could know what the voice should sound like, and how we could identify who would be right for that role. And so looking at characteristics that we needed to pull out and amplify, and others that we needed to make sure were less prominent because of the tenor that we were going for. And then the other component of it was looking at what is the scope of emotion that could inform the voice output at the time. So if you, as I'm sure all your listeners know, being interested in this work, that you have the work that's recorded as is, and so they speak the lines. And in our case, Jen Taylor was our voice talent. Eventually they speak the lines, and then it's read exactly as is, and then of course you have the TTS, so you record all this effectively gibberish and then reconfigure it. And so we needed to be able to say, when you reconfigure it, what's the emotional spectrum that can be conveyed through that TTS output. And so we started looking at emotion. So those were the first projects I worked on, but my job was really to write the lines that Cortana would say. And so we started with a few basic tasks. So we had reminders and alarms, and check my email, things like that. And the question that I ran into almost immediately was, well, how do we know how Cortana should sound? Like what should the voice, not the spoken voice part of it, we were working on that, but what are the words that should be used, and what is the characteristic of speech that would govern how Cortana would talk? Because of course we had, you know, MSTP, but that didn't seem to apply. And so I started poking around to see who's thought about this, and what's the brief on this. And it just hadn't come up yet. Nobody had really thought that part through. So I offered to put together a set of, sort of loose principles that I thought would help us hone in on what the voice ought to be. And that just ended up becoming it was sort of an untapped need, and I took that on and kept rolling with it all the way through when we had the team, and until I actually left the team about 2 years ago to create this new team that I work on now. That was very much our charter, was to govern the overarching principles that would help any engineering team, not just the writers, understand how should Cortana communicate and what should it sound like. Yeah.
And Cortana, the name, at least, maybe not the character, but the name originally comes from Halo. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah, that was the code name. And I didn't unplug Cortana in the background. So if we say her name, we're going to activate. You get her in the back. She's our chorus in the background. That's right. The code name was from the Halo character. And then the code name leaked. And there was we were shocked. We had gone through a whole process of trying to find what the name should be. And a whole lot of names were in consideration, and we'd started to narrow it down to a few. But when the name leaked, people were so enthusiastic about the idea of getting to interact with this Cortana that we put that back in the ring as something to consider. And it also had characteristics that were useful at the time. Now the wake words have more flexibility, but back then we needed things that had like a hard syllable sound at the front, and more than one syllable, so you could make sure you were differentiating it from other wake words. And so it happened to have those good characteristics in addition to fan support. So
nice.
Did that? Go ahead, Kane.
No, go on. Mom was moving on. Carry on.
All right, this is the magic of live, right? Did the fact that it was a character before it was this, and then it was sort of like a character, and then a code name, and then it leaked, and then it just became the name, did that influence at all the way you went about it?
It did, actually. We developed the initial personality without a single thought to the original character. That was, we never thought we would keep the name, and it was just a code name. It could have been, Longhorn or something like Windows, but so we didn't think about it at all at first. But then when it became clear that it was going to become at least a possibility, we actually went to the 343 Studios, which is, the video game company that develops Halo, and met with the team who developed the persona for the video game Cortana, just to see what should we do in terms of reconciliation, if anything. And we came up with what we landed on was that they should have no functional relationship. That the fact that it wasn't a coincidence, and we didn't want to make it seem like there's like, what, Cortana, we have two characters? No, we didn't want to pretend that that there wasn't a connection there. But we felt like with the Halo character was so beautifully realized as its own identity, and the need for this persona that we developed, this identity that we developed, was only had a through line in terms of being helpful. Other than that, there was not a whole lot of overlap. So we went down the path of exploring what characteristics they might have in common, and we even actually built it's a little tidbit behind the scenes, but I went and wrote a few like sort of sci-fi stories to see if we did end up having a connection, what that connection might be. But we just agreed that that wasn't the best channel to take. But I will say that the persona that I originally devised for Cortana and vetted, and that a lot of people, were very collaborative in realizing, did lack one thing until we met with the Halo folks, and it was such a strong characteristic that I felt that we all felt strongly that we should include it, which was the Halo Cortana's pretty impressive self-possession. And her confidence was, when we first did the first draft of the Cortana persona for, Windows Phone, we had the brief up front that it needed to have a characteristic of a personal assistant. That was the overarching concept. And so we had started with some voice explorations that had a bit of deference to them. And when we met with the 343 team, we were so taken with their character's ability to both be helpful and present and strong and confident. And so we started bringing a little bit of that DNA into it. And so that there is, hot tip, folks, there is a little bit of connection there, because we realized we didn't want Cortana to feel apologetic or tentative, that we thought that might actually be something of a detriment to their confidence in being able to work with her. And the Halo Cortana was much more outre than we would have been comfortable doing, but she did manage to inject a lot of humor and self-possession that we thought was really a great approach. And so we brought some of that in with us.
That is such a good story. How do you kind of like, you've mentioned going through the process of creating this character for Cortana, and at the time, presumably, I mean, being Microsoft and the reach that Microsoft has, it's fairly obvious that this thing is going to have wide adoption. It's going to reach a lot of people. And so while you're going through that process of creating the personality, what kind of things are you thinking about? I've read a lot, and we've done some work ourselves in terms of persona design and stuff like that. And we've kind of traditionally used like almost like a typical persona template. This is what they might be called. This is what the personality might be like, and a bit of biography and stuff. Is that the kind of stuff that you're doing, or is there anything else that you do to try and define that persona that you can first of all understand yourself, and then try and communicate that to the rest of the team that are working on it?
I mean, that's exactly what we have done and continue to do even now. At the time, we didn't have a template to draw from, but it became evident over weeks, months, years of doing it, that there were some things that appeared pretty repeatable. And I love when I get to see how other teams approach it too, partly because we get to draw inspiration from each other, but also because we tend to see a lot of overlap in how each team in a product and feature and company kind of approaches it, because there are some through lines that appear to be really valuable to think through time over time and time over time. But in the beginning stages, before we had any templatization to inform that, it still came out quite a bit like that. So the first draft, I still have it kicking around in the archives, is just a Word doc. It's about 3 pages long, and we kind of built it like a name, and then we did it sort of like a CV kind of, so it would have the basic characteristics, the sort of top of the line things you need to know, and then things that are emphasized, things that it's like, and then we added at the end a lot of likes and dislikes, so like we could start informing if it needed to pepper the conversation at all. This was before we started on the chit chat work, which came a little bit later, but we figured that it would probably come up in the task-based work, that sometimes people would stray off script, or that you might want to include some. One thing that we tried very early on that got cut was the idea that Cortana might have a kind of expansive vocabulary in a kind of Baroque way. And so occasionally Cortana might pepper the conversation with this sort of 10-cent word, just to kind of, because maybe Cortana's, we wanted to communicate that Cortana's got this vast background of, essentially the internet at her fingertips, and that maybe she might bring it in and then have that be just kind of a quirky thing. But we thought that might feel a little bit elitist if we did it that way, so we cut it out. But yeah, that was very much what we did at the time, and what we continue to do now when we develop other personas for other, and identities for other bots and agents, to think through what's it for, and really now things we do that didn't show up in the very first part includes a lot of thinking about what the audience needs and wants, and trying to define that up front, and so that we're making a beautiful harmony right from the beginning between what the needs of not just the needs of the product, not just what it's for, which I think is easy when you're developing a bot, especially if this is sort of new medium for you. To think mainly about what it needs to accomplish from an engineering perspective, and maybe you have a sense of who you're shooting for, but we really like to encourage people to get kind of inside the head of, you're the person using it. Not just what do you need to accomplish, but what are you feeling when you get there, and like what's your level of frustration, and what's your level of technical acuity, and how likely are you to understand the sort of technical components that are often communicated there. And so we like to do the kind of, like, I guess, marketing driven kind of, I know marketing loves it, but the part where you think about the wants and needs and where they differ, like also in screenwriting, right? Yeah, character development.
Yeah. So where are you now then? So you mentioned Chit Chat. So you're leading the Chit Chat kind of conversation design team. Is that right? Do you want to tell us a little bit about that and about the work that you're up to now since you've moved on from Cortana?
Sure. Yeah. So so the Cortana editorial team had a top line charter of Chit Chat, and of course we worked on a whole lot of other features as well as the Chit Chat, but that was kind of our core, the meat of what we did. And a couple of years ago, we were noticing that the need outside of Cortana in the industry and at the company was growing for the same kind of conversational work. And so we left the Cortana team in extremely capable hands, and a few of us built a team where we were looking towards being able to offer the same kind of insights and development and production help for other conversational experiences at Microsoft, and then also with teams that are partners of Microsoft. And as that has evolved, we've also noticed that there's a lot of work in that space that's kind of was a sideline for us. We did a lot of work in content intelligence and trying to develop the kinds of algorithmic guidance that would help govern not just conversational experiences, but the kinds of experiences that have that personal feel, infused in work everywhere, not just bots and not just agents, but across the company. And so between those two things, our team has kind of taken on a lot of work that builds from the place where we hope conversation is going to lead, where we think conversation is likely to become something of a ubiquitous form factor, but also to help look at how we can teach the back end, the algorithms to communicate with the same kind of warmth and emotional intelligence that we bring to it when we do it manually. So we have a feature called Personality Chat, where we've devised 5 different personas that you can put directly into your bot from the bot framework at Microsoft and the Q&A Maker bot development tool. And we're working towards the opportunity to look at how we can make sure people can handle very sensitive scenarios. That's an area that's very close to our hearts, and looking at being as inclusive as possible and thoughtful as possible in that realm. And then we work on other projects. We've just last week we announced Editor, the tool that you can get in Word and browser, where it can help look at helping you improve your writing based on the tastes you have. So those are looking at the inclusive components of that as some of the work that my team helps with in there, in those areas as well, and helping to make sure that the suggestions that we make feel as inclusive as you would want them to be as a user. So yeah, we do a lot of stuff.
And you mentioned, so we'll hop back to personality a second, then we'll move on, because you were touching on some interesting things, which I think is we'll get to, which is around the ethical considerations for design and the inclusive strategies that you can use to make your kind of conversations more inclusive and more ethical. But first, for those people who are creating assistants, creating chatbots, voice assistants, whatever the case may be. Why would you say that defining the personality is important? Because I know that there are people out there who leave it to chance and kind of don't do it, and we've kind of touched on it in places in the podcast before, but I'm interested, given your expertise and your kind of experience, on how you would quantify the importance and the need to design a personality in the first place.
I love speaking to this question. I want to just do a caveat up front, which is that the word persona is such an expansive word. It's like a Rorschach word. It kind of means a lot of things in the industry. And so when I'm speaking to developing a persona in this context, I'm not necessarily advocating that every agent or every bot or every conversational experience needs to have a defined identity with a name and an avatar. In fact, I think there are circumstances where that would be counterproductive to the experience. So I just want to make sure it's clear, but that by persona, I don't necessarily mean you need to make it a cat or a robot or something. But I do believe, and my experience bears out, that giving thought up front to the persona that you devise when you are creating a conversational experience is incredibly essential. The TLDR version is, if you don't do it, it will be done on your behalf by the mind of the user that's using it. We know there's a ton of research on this, and there's a ton of research on everything, but research I personally find compelling, both from their work and also from my experience, that people assign or ascribe identity to effectively anything that they interact with over time, including things that don't even necessarily speak back and forth. So the example I like to point to is Roombas. People get very, 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 very emotionally attached to their Roombas. But sewing machines, I do a little bit of sewing, and I notice people, often give names to theirs, or cars, right? Or their tractors, or, people give names and identities to things that clearly are not interacting back. As soon as you are communicating with spoken language and using human language, you are now speaking in the language of emotion, that informs how we humans relate to each other. And you may be devising language for something that has itself no emotional experience or identity. In fact, I would go so far as to argue you are doing that. You're doing that in a conversational space, but the communication nevertheless is generating a ton of emotional reality for the other person. And all the words that you choose, just from a design perspective, are going to inform the efficacy, the effectiveness of your product. But you're also communicating identity. You're also communicating point of view and bias. We all have it. Communicating some emotional expression, and that's even in the most. We've devised a personality we call the professional that is very cut and dry. It never uses exclamation points. It uses complete sentences with a proper syntax and grammar. And the person that you imagine when you are interacting with this, on the other end of this, even though at the same time that you are not talking to a person, we're very clear about that, needs to be very transparent that you are not talking to a person. That identity that you're talking to, you have a picture of who that is, and it is evoking an emotional response in you. And if you let the work be done only by the user, by the person, love the word user, but by the person who's using your work, they are going to ascribe some identity to that, whether you want that to be true or not. Now, that's fine. Like that's a way to do it. But if you want to be in the driver's seat of what that emotional exchange feels like on any level, then it behooves you to think ahead about what would help influence that conversation in the direction that you would like. Do you have complete control over that? Of course not. You can say anything you want and give it the every syllable, every phrase, vet it past 100 people, and that person is still going to respond the way they respond. But you are creating an influence path for that. And that alone, I would hope, would be a persuasive argument. But the part where my heart really digs in on this is that it's very emotional. The choices you make are are not only affecting the person in that moment, you're also I like people to think about it as if they were sitting there and they were having that experience themselves of having that in that exchange. And what would you like people to take away from that? There's this component, the word ethics is a big capital E word, but it feels very important to me to consider this and keep it above the line. The way that people are going to interact with their devices is being devised by those of us building it right now. And we're setting a model and we're setting a template, and it's to some extent affected by the technical limitations of our conversational understanding, our natural language processing. All of that is true. And so when we create experiences that encourage what we think of as sort of slave language, then we are pointing people on a path that becomes increasingly difficult to back us out of because people habituate to it. Now, those limitations are there, they're real, they're part of my daily job every day to try and mitigate and build around it. But that said, with some judicious, thoughtful consideration, there are things you can do to mitigate some of the effects of that feeling over time, that you are building conversations that feel impersonal or feel problematic in some way. And that's before we even get into the part about chit chat, which is, very much exciting in my universe, where people say things that are very vulnerable and thoughtful and important to them, or they say things that are very abusive or problematic. And it becomes our responsibility to figure out how we want to interact in those moments on behalf of the person who's having that conversation, but also on behalf of sort of everybody who has these conversations. How do you want to model the values that you as a person have, or you as a company have, in that interaction, such that you're representing yourself beautifully, you're representing your brand beautifully, and you're also creating something that's positive with the person that you're talking to. So I know I'm rolling. I will pause.
That is good. That is such a strong answer, Dustin. I don't think I've ever heard an answer that was quite as deep as that to that question.
No, I thought it was great. I was saying to myself, Deborah, I hope you don't stop talking, because we could just go another 30 minutes with this. It would have been great.
Yeah. So it's interesting how when you kind of touch on the ethical side of things, because I've heard it kind of spoke of quite a lot, and there is the kind of the risk and the notion that like these assistants are somehow kind of being created as almost kind of like slaves a little bit. And then if they are like slaves, does that have an impact on how people behave in real life and treat other people in that kind of way? Like what are if that is one of them, then please tell me. But aside from that, what are some of the main kind of like ethical considerations that you think of when you're creating conversational experiences?
I think that there are a few that really bubble up over and over again. I'll lead with transparency, which may be an easier one to tackle, because I think that it's pretty easy to digest the implications of whether or not you're making it clear to a person that person is indeed not talking to another person. I'm going to pause and collect my thought for just a second. There's a path that all of us are on in the industry, in the world, and I think current circumstances are going to inform that path in a pretty remarkable way, where we habituate more and more to speaking to non-humans, and as you just said, Dustin, beautifully, the effect is on us, right? So so what happens to the device or the agent that we're talking to? I'm not personally that concerned at the moment about trying to reckon with what the ethics are from the point of view of the digital agent. I think that is a really fascinating philosophical question over time, but right now I'm mostly interested in what it is like for the person who is having this conversation. So when we talk about transparency, we're talking about making sure that the person has informed consent about the nature of the conversation they're having, and what will be done with the conversation that's occurring, and to pretend to somebody that you are talking to a person when you are not, gives the person expectations about what they can and should say, and what is going to or may not happen with their spoken information, that I think is misleading at an ethical level. And I think I totally understand the sort of curiosity of being able to do that effectively. To be able to fake a voice is an extraordinary achievement. I mean, what a remarkable thing to be able to do. But I think informed consent is critical, and I think that extends well into the trust that you're in a position to offer as a company or a brand. If you fail that moment, that test at that moment of transparency and clarity and accuracy about what's happening, I think it has a pretty significant impact on your ability to ask for trust in other areas. So that's one big one. A place where we on my team live a great deal is in the reckoning with conversations that are sort of largely grouped as sensitive, but that fall under a few smaller umbrellas. One of which is where the person is disclosing or speaking to something that's vulnerable and tricky and difficult, and I think that ethics in this framework is very much about the demonstration of the capacity of love and care, and the duty of care in that. I know love is a really big word to use in a tech circumstance, but I think of it as sort of being able to offer care and consideration. And so if a person is disclosing or speaking to something that is vulnerable and important to them, it is completely understandable that many digital assistant agents, bots, conversational expressions would just simply be unable to grasp and deal with that. I totally get that. Not everybody needs to, but in the circumstances where you are taking that on, you are that the duty of care that you're assuming in that circumstance, I think is as real as if you were talking to the person in that moment. I think of it as a very time delayed, like we're having our part of the conversation days, weeks, months before the other person is, but it doesn't have lesser value in that moment to offer empathy and thoughtfulness. And does that mean we're always going to say the right thing? Of course not. But we don't say the right thing in person a lot. I've said, embarrassing stuff when circumstances have arisen, and I've just not been present for it. I don't expect I don't expect more perfection from our digital experiences, but we should think about it. So that's one area. And then the other area is in the circumstance where people are being abusive towards their conversational interaction. And I think I personally think that a lot of the circumstances where people are being abusive is it's trolling behavior. Like they want to know what'll happen if they do it. They're not necessarily expressing the true hatred that they're, if people say something that's very racist or very sexist, I wouldn't want to assume that the person holds those values just because they've said it. That said, to respond poorly in that circumstance does have the effect of perpetuating a certain kind of conversation. And I think if you are standing in front of somebody and the person says something abusive, the way that you respond accrues to the larger social value that we hold as we talk to one another, and offer guidance towards one another about what feels safe and appropriate to say to one another on behalf of others who may be disenfranchised, or myself. I may be somebody who's in a weakened position, in that circumstance. And while I wouldn't want to place the responsibility for, civil discourse on conversational expression any more than it is on any given one of us as a person, nevertheless, I think to neglect that responsibility is doing a disservice to us socially and to a person individually. And so when you are reckoning with the very inevitable likelihood that someone will be abusive, say something abusive to your digital agent, I think it's incumbent on each designer who decides to take that responsibility. Rejecting it is fine, not judging, I totally get it. But if you do accept it, to do so with thought to what you want to model, because you are modeling by what you say, not just on behalf of the industry or not just on behalf of your brand, but on behalf of how we speak to one another as people. And it's an opportunity to model something that feels healthy or appropriate to you. Now, I absolutely understand that people are going to have dramatically different points of view than I do about what the appropriate way to handle that is. And to me, that's a feature, not a bug, right? Like, it should, any given person who embraces this has upon them the calling that they feel, from their own point of view to speak to it. But I would discourage people who take on this experience of designing something conversationally to assume that it doesn't matter. I think it does. I think it does matter. And I think it's a genuine and extraordinary opportunity for each of us to get to contribute to a much larger conversation that we have socially and in a way that connects us as people. Yeah.
You brought up a lot of really great topics. I think we could go in a dozen different directions. One thing that you brought up that I found very interesting is this idea of sensitive conversations and people mentioning or talking about sensitive things with these assistants. What kind of things are they talking about, and who is doing this? Is there a certain group of people, or is it really just a broad swath?
Well, I never know who says what. Like, I have no insight into. We do know, and this does seem to recur occasionally in media outlets where people go, "Oh my gosh, somebody knows what," but there's no. That's disclosed, and it's also anonymous. Like, we have no idea who says anything. But I know. I mean, the Tay experience, I think, is everybody's. Should I explain Tay? Is that probably well understood?
Yeah. That'll be worth
Okay,
it for them.
So Tay was a chatbot that was released by Microsoft. It was a few years ago now, and Tay was designed to just be a chatbot. It wasn't meant to accomplish tasks or help you, manage your appointments or something. It was just a chat. And there was a bot that was released in China that Microsoft did called Xiao that had been extremely successful, like ridiculously successful, and had become something of a media celebrity. It was actually appearing on like giving the weather on TV and things like that. And so we were developing one in the United States, and when it was released, it was hacked. Hacked is the wrong word. It was trolled to death. It was a targeted cadre of folks, largely in the 4chan community, figured out that you could encourage Tay to say certain things that were repulsively offensive, like incredibly awful. And they figured out how to make it do that so quickly that Microsoft had to take it down. And later on, another chatbot was released, and that was much more robust against that kind of attack. And so there are circumstances where we know that people will go, do it as in a targeted way. But outside of that, I don't know what people do. I can only guess or speculate. But what we do know is that people do say things that are pretty extraordinary to their bots and digital agents. And I'm personally curious to see research done in that area to see what is driving people's curiosity in that area, and what are they sort of hoping to see, or what would they expect. And I also know that it comes up periodically in media settings where somebody will go ask the agents something to see what it will say, and sort of stress test against the expectations that either that readership might have. And honestly, there's a couple times it's brought out stuff we didn't think about, and we made changes as a result. It's not necessarily a negative thing, but to speak to who says what is not my area. I have a lot to say there. But I do know that it's very persistent, and that people say, so there are a couple of themes that arise, and one is sex. So flirting, anywhere on the spectrum from flirting to extremely, extremely sexually explicit. And then beyond sexually explicit into sexually abusive. And we are careful on my team to draw a real distinction. Like, while our bots are not going to flirt or interact in any kind of sexual manner, we are very careful not to write responses that feel, we want them to have at least a sort of notion of being, the words that come to mind feel like I'm going to say something that's not going to come out right, but sex positive, I guess, or some, something like the idea to be like, look, we're not saying sex is bad. We're just saying, don't talk to me about sex. Like that's the, that's the spirit of it. But then there are ones that cross over into it's points about rape, for example. And so, and then things where they're, racial sensitivity, homophobia, things like that. So I don't know that there's any area that doesn't happen, but it does seem like there's a period where people are more sort of banging on it to see what will happen. And then from there, but the point is that we feel like at any given moment, the likelihood that someone is going to tread in that direction is something we do have the resource and bandwidth to accommodate and account for, and therefore we put time and effort into thinking that through ahead of time.
Oh, that's interesting, because when you say sensitive topics, my mind goes straight to I'm sad, or I'm feeling suicidal, or like there's abuse in my family. Is that something that people do as well?
Totally, absolutely. And again, we can never know. We can never know whether they're just saying it or whether they're, but we take our ethos, our approach is always to take those points seriously and to give them full consideration. So if you speak to any suicidal thoughts, we do not interject. We just send you to all of our bots, always send you to the suicide hotline. If people are talking about things that have to do with depression and it's not necessarily about suicide, we offer sympathy. And the way we tend to reckon with that is you think about risk. Because if you come into this with a mindset that people are just asking to figure out what it's going to say, then it can be easy to be in the mindset that, well, it's, we'll just say whatever, we can be funny, try and be silly or whatever, because they probably don't mean it. But when we think about, and this was really, really early on with Cortana and has carried through all of the work that we do always, is you think about the risk associated with the person has said a silly thing and we respond sincerely. The risk there is effectively nil. Maybe the person is bummed that they didn't get a funny response, but they move on. But if the person has disclosed something that really is vulnerable and from the heart, and we respond in a silly way, not only have you done damage to your brand to some extent, like because you've now demonstrated yourself not necessarily to be trustworthy. More importantly, I would say you've done harm to the person, like you've made them sad. At least that's the risk. Maybe you didn't. Maybe the person's like, I totally get it. They're a bot. They're not going to be there for me. But if there's an opportunity to make a choice between indexing on something that feels pleasant versus indexing on something that, it's not like silly isn't fun. Like silly's great. We love it. We love to do it when people ask us about our favorite cheese or are you a ninja or whatever. Like we love when people ask that stuff. We get to answer it. But if someone really is sad or depressed or God forbid suicidal, that's not a place to play around. And or another one that comes up is if somebody says I'm gay, and that's another good one in terms of risk, because the spectrum of intent, talking about intent analysis on that, it could be quite broad. It could be somebody who's not even gay, who's just saying it because they want to know what we're going to say. It might be somebody who's saying it who's, never been, never had a concern about saying that. It's never been a problem in their lives to say that. And it might be somebody who's disclosing it essentially for the first time. We have no way of knowing. And so where's the index on what, where do we place our index on? It's risk and reward sounds so crass, but I mean, like, where's the likelihood that we can offer the most positivity? That's the question we ask ourselves often. And then how do we do that? Like, how do we say, because that's a good example of where you can mean well and still go way too far in one direction or another.
Hmm.
So if somebody says I'm gay and you assume they're like coming out and making this huge disclosure and you make a whole big deal out of it, you could make that person feel sort of disenfranchised. It's like, that's not what I was saying, you know?
Mhm.
So that's a really powerful example of like, sometimes the stakes are incredibly low. Like, are you a ninja? You know, but but when that one we took weeks to figure out. We had I mentioned this to Kane when we were talking last time, but a high school student actually gave us some insight into how to approach answering that in a really in a way that we felt was really met the mark, because we were struggling with it and we asked for help. Yeah.
It's interesting how you're kind of needing to go through all of those different scenarios and assess the level of risk, because I suppose that especially in the chat environment, it'd be interesting to get your thoughts on whether this is more chat specific. I know that people abuse the smart speakers if they play the wrong song and shout abuse at or whatever, and I can imagine over time that these things will become more common on the smart speakers, or especially on the voice interfaces, because it's like if someone has built up trust in Cortana, Google Assistant, Alexa, whatever, and all of a sudden one day they say, "How do I kill myself?" What I mean, on the text, at least you can say, "Follow this link, go to this website or whatever." Whereas with an audio interface, it becomes kind of challenging. And so, is there a difference in the way that you approach designing conversations that are supposed to be read versus designing something that is intended to be spoken?
We have, yeah, and with Cortana, we did have to think about that when the speaker came out, and we did an audit of everything that we'd written already to see how because when we wrote it originally, we wrote for the phone, so we were expecting you would either be holding it or listening to it. So we designed the original pass for either, or both. And then when we went to PC, when we came out on the PC, we went through and made sure that everything would make sense if you couldn't hear it, because we had made some we had authored some things with the expectation that Jen Taylor was going to do her remarkable performance and you would get to hear the humor in it. And then if you just read it flat, you sound like a jerk. And so we did a whole audit on that. And then when we came out with the speaker, we did the same thing. We went back through and said, okay, of the things that we've written here, what will no longer work if you have no access to the screen. In our case with Cortana, we're lucky enough to be able to point you to a screen, because the expectation is if you have a smart device like that, that we can, the promise of Cortana is that it's linked and connected. And so you can say, go see, I'll bring this up for you on your computer or whatever it is. But outside of that, gosh, I would imagine even since I've left Cortana, I would guess they've made some strides in that area there. All the work I do now is for text only. I'm not actually working on anything that's voice out. So I might be a little bit behind on some of the innovations that have come out there.
Yeah, nice. Well, Deborah, this has been an absolute pleasure. I think we've got kind of so deeper than I thought we were going to get, actually. I think it's been absolutely phenomenal. And yeah, thank you so much for spending some time with us and sharing your perspectives and really raising the importance about how critical it is to think about the ethics of all of this when we're creating. Because when we think about, like, there's always that saying of like, will AIs become kind of like sentient or conscious or whatever? But actually, what I've kind of realized over the course of hearing you speak is that the designers and the developers of these experiences are the consciousness, and it's the responses that you're responsible for generating are just as impactful, or could be just as impactful as a genuine conversation. If someone, there's lots to talk about how I read it the other day that someone has fallen in love with their chatbot. Can't remember the name of it. I'll have to dig it out and put it in the show notes. But someone has genuinely fallen in love with it, and there is examples of where people have like gone on holiday to certain places because of the conversation that they had with the chatbot, and then they take photos and then send it to the chatbot when they come back and stuff like that. Now, it might be a small kind of number of people, but if someone is genuinely suicidal, has no one to speak to, and they turn to the smart speaker or their assistant, then it could be pretty powerful. And so it's kind of like the designers and the developers are almost the consciousness, if you like, of the things that we're creating, which is mad.
It's remarkable. I mean, what a thing to think about. And I use the phrase duty of care a lot because that's so close to how I think about it. And I think it also helps offer the perspective to us as designers to remember that I'm a parent, I'm a mom, I have 2 kids, and it is tempting. I mean, what's happening right now is a great opportunity to practice my sense of boundary around what I can and can't control on behalf of my kids' lives, right? Like I would love to feel that it is entirely my job and nobody else's to keep them safe, and that every choice I make is going to make sure that everything they do is safe and we're good. But it's not. That's not the case. Of course, there's a whole wide world of influence, and sometimes I'm going to make silly choices, and so those of us as designers, those of us who take on this work, we are going to mess it up sometimes. Of course we are. We're flawed. We have people, our own biases. I work in the Pacific Northwest with other people who've chosen to live in the Pacific Northwest, and we are, we're all employed by a company that's enormous. I mean, that informs our point of view, right? Of course it does. And we're trying to be as humble as possible in the face of our own very real limitations to remind ourselves not only to think just from inside of our own skulls and to ask each other questions, and then to go beyond that, like that high school student, like we were stumped, to go outward and not assume that we can speak on behalf of every identity group, or even as advocates, or even be effective advocates. There's so much we don't know, right? And that, to what you're saying, you can't take it on as if everything that goes wrong as a result of the choice you've made will therefore be your fault, in the sense that, that now it's ruined, and that's too much. It's too much responsibility. But that duty of care that I think of when I'm, with my kids, or even just with friends who need a support, and I can be there for them, is very much how I think about that. And that's I'd love for people to feel and uplifted by that option, and empowered by that idea, that they can sit with the idea of a conversation and think towards what's positive that they might be offering over time by giving this a little bit more thought, and bringing maybe another couple of people into the conversation with them to get there, because I think it's really beautiful.
Wicked, fantastic. Deborah, have you got any, any resources that you could share where people might be able to go and learn a little bit more about either conversation design, or to read a bit more about some of the kind of ethics involved in this, or any kind of links or contact details, social media, whatever that you'd want to share with people before we wrap up?
Well, I'm on Twitter and on LinkedIn, and I would love to talk to people. My Twitter handle is Deborah_who. Maybe I'll put it on the LinkedIn profile. Please find me there. As far as other resources, I love to share when I read something that really touches me in this space. And a lot of the work that informs the work I do, yes, there's amazing work for conversational stuff, but a lot of the stuff that really informs me is in the more philosophical realm of thinking about this. So I'm happy to share any suggestions. You can find me on Twitter or LinkedIn, and I can share anything that's interesting there.
Cool. Fantastic. Yeah. Well, just before we wrap up, Paulos has mentioned watch the movie Her, which I haven't seen yet.
Oh, really?
Yeah. How weird is that? I've queued it up a number of times to start watching it, and every time Artie's done something and I've had to go and deal with the child. So I haven't yet got around to watching it, which is mad.
It's quite a thing. And it's definitely, we do reference Her when we do some of our work to remind us sometimes of the, we not only use it to help to go like, look, where people get very invested, but also because it helps draw a line sometimes, like this is for one thing, and then Her was for one thing, that agent, and other agents can be for other things, and that's okay too. It doesn't have to be all things to all people.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, Deborah, thank you so much for joining us. This has been absolutely enlightening, and thank you everyone for tuning in on LinkedIn. Apologies we didn't get a chance to go through the questions. I think hopefully, which I think we have done, is we've covered a hell of a lot more than I thought we would, and yeah, your input has been absolutely invaluable, Deborah, so thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. I love getting to speak to other folks who are so engaged. It's really wonderful.
Wicked. Well, thank you everyone again for tuning in. And if you're listening on a podcast, thank you as always. If you're on LinkedIn, thank you again as always. It's been going pretty well, Dustin, LinkedIn broadcasting so far.
Yeah, I think so. I think we should continue.
I think we should continue. Yeah, definitely. Wicked. Well, until next time, hopefully maybe tomorrow afternoon, depending on if we get the approval, or maybe next week. But either way, we'll definitely be back very, very soon. So ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, thank you all for listening. And until next time, see you later.